Okay, good morning, everyone. Another presentation on price transmission, but this time on developing countries. This is a work I did back in 2011, and I'm going to speak very briefly about the impact on food security, the persistence of food price volatility, and the transmission at the level, at the mean of the price series, but also at the variance. Then this will give us a good insight about which is more important. Is it the international shocks that are important or the domestic shocks? And finally, I'm going to talk about policies, specifically two policies only, which are based on the results of this work. This is a very nice graph that was prepared by my colleagues in the commodity unit of FAO. It starts in May 2010, ends in May 2011. It's the prices of wheat, maize, and oilseeds, and tells you the complexity of the markets. We start in June with droughts in Russia. Prices go up. Then we have the Russian export ban. Prices shoot up. Then FAO comes in with the intergovernmental group on grains, the body on grains in the commodity problems, in the Committee of Commodity Problems, tries to calm the markets a bit, but then in September, USDA revised downwards their estimates about the crop. And so on. We have floods in Pakistan, political tensions, oil prices are volatile. The result is what you see in this graph. It's quite complex. It is not only the volatility politicians are worrying, it is the impact of high prices on food security. And these are results based on a demand model for maize in Malawi, Zambia, and Uganda. It is a simulation of a 50% increase in the price of maize. And look what happens in Malawi. 50% increase in the price of maize, and the demand goes down only by 5%. The diet is not diversified. About 40% of their food expenditure goes to maize. In Uganda, this is not the same story. They have other staples, and they can, like sweet potatoes, matoke, which is bananas, and they can diversify very easily. So they do that. The problem is on expenditure. A 50% increase in the price of maize will increase food expenditure in Malawi by 15%. And this is the result. This is the impact of the 50% increase in maize on food security. 13% of households in Malawi fall below the food security threshold. So this is quite important. Is the price level and the volatility it brings are equally important for us. My work is based on price data, monthly price data in Peru, Mexico, India, Philippines, Malawi, and Niger. I'll speak only for a few of these countries. And what I do time series modeling. These prices are non-stationary, all of them, which means that the shock on the price is permanent. It does not fade away. The analysis also shows that in these prices, volatility is clustering. There are periods of high volatility and periods of low volatility. And I'm using time series models. I'm using a vector error correction model and a GARTS model. I'm sorry. Time series modeling is full of GARTS, T-GARTS, star, funny names. But I am one of these people that look at the number if it is below 1. And don't worry about that. I just wanted to draw your attention on the differences in modeling. Yesterday we talked about Agling and Cosimo. These are models that are based on economic theory. In time series, we don't care about economic theory. Or we estimate and we think later about economic theory. Steve presented the elasticity of price transmission. It was a functional elasticity of price transmission. In time series, you don't worry about that. And Miranda's presentation was a very good example of how time series are used. You estimate your model, and then you do interviews. You try to find what happened. But the vacuum gives you the conditional expectation of the price for the mean. So if we go in Malawi, it tells us that this will be the mean according to the world price. It is a long-run equilibrium relationship between the world price and the price in Malawi, but it also tells us about the divergence. These two prices may be in an equilibrium, but sometimes they diverge, and then they correct. The markets correct this divergence. The Beck, awful name, it's a GARS. It's the volatility spillover. And it measures, it estimates volatility according to its past values. So if you have large volatility today, you may have large volatility tomorrow. This is animal spirits today, more animal spirits tomorrow. It's the herding. It also determines, specifies volatility on the past errors of the long-run equilibrium. And these are the bad and the good news. So if you have bad news is Ukraine threatening for an export restrictions, or USDA is revising downward their crop. Good news is FAO calling for a meeting to increase transparency in the international markets. But this is the only thing you have to take from this one. Some numbers, you only worry about the top row of the number, which tells you the speed of convergence. So if you go to Mexico, it is minus 0.11. It tells you that the price in Mexico, the price of maize in Mexico and the price of maize in the world market are moving together. But if the price of Mexico diverges, this divergence is corrected by 11% each month. That's very slow. If you go in India, it is 16% each month. This is the price of rice. But India also determines the world price because it's a big producer. In Malawi, it's the same thing, 11% per month, the correction back to the long-run equilibrium. These are slow. These are quite slow rates, even for Africa. For us, the Ethiopian coffee market is more or less the market we compare other markets in Africa, and it's quite fast. It's about 40% per month. The Ethiopian coffee market is well integrated in the world coffee in the world market. For volatility, I will not present numbers. I will give you these graphs, and this is more or less the history of volatility from 2000 to the end of 2009 at the world price. So you see that in the wheat market and in the maize market, volatility has started increasing since 2003. And then we have the big explosion in 2008. Rice market, the world rice market is very interesting. There is no volatility. And this is quite important if you think that the world rice market is very thin. About 7% of rice produced is traded. And then suddenly, in 2008, bang, volatility explodes. This is the maize market in Mexico. It's, you know, in United Nations, we manage presentation, discussions in multi-stakeholder audience, but it's quite difficult to manage two screens with a pillar in the middle. So I'll move over here now. You get the volatility, which is in the blue line, and the conditional correlation, which is the green line. The conditional correlation is the correlation between the variances. It tells us about spillover. And when I first saw this graph, I thought, oh, it goes from positive to negative values. It is extremely strange. This is an old technique, and they used this technique before the euro came on the exchange rates of the European countries. And you can see that in the period of 10 years, the correlation, the conditional correlation of the exchange rates was strengthening. It was going up towards 1 as the monetary markets of these countries, they were converging. This is the story we get from all markets we have studied. It's extremely difficult. There is no other interesting thing in Mexico, just that the market is quite volatile, and we have a big bout of volatility in 2008. In Mexico, they didn't try to do anything in policy-wise. They formed a public and private partnership with the Chamber of Commerce, and a lot of food processors agreed not to pass the cost to the consumers. But at the end, you see, they had the tortilla war and quite an increase in the price of maize. Well, no, it's that way. Okay. That's an interesting case. Malawi. Again, you see the conditional correlation goes wherever it wants. It's not both the mean, changes in the mean, and changes in the variance are not transmitted very well. But what you see, look at the conditional variance of Malawi in 2008. It increases, but does not increase a lot. And look at the conditional variance in 2002, when Malawi faced a very significant food crisis due to drought during the harvest. Actually, volatility in 2002 dwarfs volatility in 2008. But we cannot see, looking at the correlation, if you look at the green line around 2008, it's negative, it's positive. You cannot get a clear story. This tells you that it's probably domestic sources that increase this volatility. And in the case of Malawi, it is actually policy. Malawi has got 2 marketing boards. The first is the Agricultural Development Marketing Board that more or less manages the maize market. There is another marketing board which is only for food security, the Food Reserve Agency. What happened is that their early warning system said that, wow, there is maize surplus this year. So ADMARC, the marketing board, got into the market, started buying aggressively at a period when everything in the world market was exploding. So prices exploded in Malawi. ADMARC continued, had the mandate to buy a number of thousands of tons, continued to buy aggressively. The politicians blamed the traders, and trade was illegal. They declared trade illegal. And at the end, there was a huge increase in the price of maize in Malawi. I prefer to do India first. This is the blue line is the volatility in India, and the red line is the volatility. Let's move over here. Is the volatility in the world market. So you see that the world market is tranquil for years and years, and then we have the explosion. Compare this with the variance in India. We have a big spike in 2003. This is because of climatic conditions. And in 2008, nearly nothing. It's the export restriction. They panicked. They imposed the export restriction. The world thought that was very bad news. And we have a huge bout of volatility in the world market. Another interesting case, Philippines. Philippines, exactly more or less the same, are in the same situation with India. They have a parastatal marketing board. They manage their rice market through stocks and trade. But Philippines, between 2006 and 2008, became quite a significant importer, actually the biggest importer of rice in the world market. When things became bad in the world market, in Philippines they became very nervous and they started buying aggressively in the world market. They were buying at a price of $1,000 per ton. And still, by doing that, look at the spike in their volatility. They didn't manage to do anything. So what do these tests tell us? The first thing is that price changes in the world market are only partly transmitted in the domestic markets of developing countries. And many times domestic shocks matter more than shocks in the world price. We had a lot of problems in developing countries, but these came probably not because of transmission, but because of the cost of trade finance. As Aleko Seris mentioned yesterday about problems in developing countries that they didn't have the money to guarantee their imports. And finally, it tells us about export restrictions, which they have created not only in rice in 2008, but also in other markets later on, quite a significant bout of volatility. So it is only two things, two policies I would like to put on the floor. The first is stocks. We had a very nice discussion yesterday on stocks. And the second is export restrictions. I spoke about Malawi, what happened in Malawi, but I had a project at that time, and I also studied Zambia, and Zambia had a different way of dealing with things. They have the Food Reserve Agency that is a big player in the market, but the problem is that when the Food Reserve Agency gets into the market, creates a bit of panic. They come in, they come out. There is no a kind of predictable behavior. They needed only 200,000 tons of maize. So the government went to the private sector and said, look, we're open. You import 100,000 tons, so we work with you, and our marketing board imports another 100,000 tons. And then the private trader said, fine, we will do that, but we want guarantees from you, the government, that with your reserve, you are not going to intervene in the market. The government said, I'm sorry, during these times we cannot give you this kind of guarantees, and the private traders withdrew. They didn't import anything. The government didn't have the money to import the 200,000 tons, so prices went up. It's something, I mean, stocks, if you use them as buffer, they're quite difficult. If you look at rice in Indonesia, Bulog works like a central bank with open market operations like central banks do. And their capacity is huge. Their analytical capacity and their logistic capacity. It is also extremely expensive. And even these reserves, they're not the proper instrument to defend against price ceilings. They're good to defend the floor, stabilize the prices, but when you have a price spike, you spend a lot of money probably from nothing. So our position on stocks is that we need small strategic reserves only for emergency, and these reserves, they have to be linked downstream with an early warning system, so there is a capacity to do analysis, and also with food safety nets upstream. So the food does not get into the market in order to influence the price. Of course, this presupposes that you have a good social protection system in the country, which is not always the case. The second policy is export restrictions, and this is very important. 2 minutes. Oh my God. This is very important. When we were working on the G20 on food price volatility, we made a proposal to the G20, and that was to improve market access and develop a notification system in WTO. There is an asymmetry between import and export disciplines in WTO. They didn't accept that. They only accept the proposal we made about when they impose export restrictions to still sell food to WFP. They accepted this, but they didn't push for this in WTO. So it is an informal agreement between the heads of state, but it's not formal within WTO. And we were quite disappointed about that. We will push it again this year, but one has to understand that it was a bad time for the WTO with the Doha round. Now, in the post-Bali period, era, we may be lucky. But these are kind of formal rules, and the G20 are an informal club. So we believe that first, the signature of the heads of state counts, that they will provide WFP with food, and second, there is an informal forum in the architecture that works well, and this is AMIS, which consists of 10 international organizations, the G20, but also non-G20 countries. Now, AMIS has got a body of senior decision makers, which is called the Rapid Response Forum. So high-level ranking officers, they come together once per year, and if there is a crisis, they will have to sit on the same table. We didn't tell them when we set this up, but we set this up as a deterrent for export restrictions. And it worked. We had some problems in 2012 with Ukraine threatening to impose an export restriction because of the drought in the US. It didn't happen. It's an informal way to get what we want. So I think I used all my time. Well, thank you very much for your attention.